Time to light it up.
We are continuing stuff that we've never done before on this channel. We are reviewing an actual Netflix series called The Toys That Made Us.
Yeah, and I actually was looking forward to this episode more than the Barbie one. Because, like I said on the Barbie review, I really didn't know all that much about Barbie. It became an actual interesting review and an interesting show. So that was really, but because of that, I was actually really looking forward to this episode.
If you're interested in the history of these toy franchises, I mean, this is it. This is the show that you've been looking for.
Well, I remember in the 1980s when this came out, I actually had no clue as to what it was. Had no clue, never heard of it. I remember seeing it in the stores, but I didn't really pay any attention to it whatsoever. Didn't know anything about it. And the only reason that I found out anything about it was because my neighbor who lived across the alley from me when I lived in St. Louis, he got into it. And he's like, oh man, I want to get the He-Man figures. I got to get the He-Man figures. And I'm like, what's He-Man? You know, I'm like, what are you talking about? You haven't seen the He-Man figures? I'm like, yeah, what is it? And he's like, oh man, I love them. I love them. Next thing I know, here's the cartoon of He-Man Masters of the Universe. So I sat down to watch the cartoon, and I remember I don't think I was overly crazy about it, but it was like it was on every afternoon. It was whenever I got home from school, He-Man was on. So I would sit there and watch it because it was like the only thing, only cartoons on at the time. So I watched He-Man and G.I. Joe and all of that, and I got into it because that's what I saw every day. And I was like, this isn't too bad. I actually kind of like this. And the one character I loved in it, there was two characters I loved the most in it. And one of them, of course, was Skeletor, and the other one was Orko. I absolutely love those characters. And I was like, yeah, man, I got to find the figures of these.
And what you just said there was my childhood, Vince. I remember the school bus pulling up in front of my house, jumping off the school bus, running into my room, and I had a beanbag at the time. And I fell into the beanbag and turned the TV on, and He-Man was on. And that was me coming home from school. Every single day, I would come home and watch He-Man, and then I would watch, I think, G.I. Joe was either on after it, and then there was the Thundercats, and then I switched the channel and watched the Silverhawks. I don't know if you remember that one. Those were my 4 cartoons every day, without fail. And I guess it was like one of my first soap operas, because G.I. Joe really was a soap opera, the cartoon, and we'll get to that when we do the review. But I, again, loved He-Man. I thought the cartoon was incredible. And again, at that point, I was old enough to, I don't remember how old I was when it came on, but I wasn't really collecting figures. But when it came on, it's like I had to have Trapjaw. Trapjaw was one of my favorite figures from He-Man.
Oh, yeah.
And like you said, Skeletor, and I loved He-Man. And the thing, too, and this is weird, is I thought Orko was great. And he came off as like this sort of a corny character that was supposed to be annoying, sort of like Snarf in Thundercats. But he was cool, though. And even today, I still like Orko. And when the figures come out, I have to have Orko. I mean, he's like the number one, I gotta have Orko, because I've always just liked this character. I don't know why, I can't explain it, but I did.
Okay, yeah, when I mentioned Skeletor and Orko, those were like the two that I wanted to get the most when I first saw the cartoon. I was like, man, I've got to get those. But yeah, when they introduced Trapjaw and they introduced the figure of Trapjaw, oh my gosh, I could not wait to get Trapjaw. Trapjaw became number 1 for me. And what's really weird is they barely ever mention him in this at all, in this documentary. They hardly mentioned Trapjaw at all. They kind of showed him, and they kind of showed their new vision for something about him, but that was it. And he was like one of the biggest characters. I remember going to school and hearing, other kids talking to other kids, and they would be like, oh yeah, Trapjaw. And even David, talking to him, we were all into Trapjaw. I was like, can't wait to get that figure.
And the other guy that I loved in the show, I actually loved the figure, and it was stupid. The figure was dumb, but and I never got the figure, Vince. I have a ton of He-Man figures. I got one right here. I mean, this is obviously He-Man himself. And one thing I want to mention here, that after this review, I'm going to be reviewing all the He-Man figures that I have. And I have the original He-Man here, and I have, when it came back out, and which we'll talk about in a minute, and they brought out a new He-Man, and they actually have yet another He-Man that just came out a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to be showing sort of the history of He-Man on the review after this, and I can't wait to do that. One of my favorite figures, and we used to draw comics when we were little, the Lester Block comics, and one of my favorite He-Man figures was Faker. I loved Faker, and I even put Faker into our comics that we used to draw.
Oh yeah. I remember that was another one. That was like the next big one right after Trapjaw was Faker.
So let's get on to the show here. Truthfully, I had no idea where He-Man came from. I didn't have the remotest clue, which is, again, why I wanted to see this so bad. And he basically came from nowhere. I mean, he came from just these people's imaginations, and they would go out and they would watch these boys play with their toys and stuff, and they're like, oh, hey, let's try out different stuff. And they literally just made up the line, which is kind of unheard of now. If there's not a cartoon or a movie or something that's based on it, it don't get made.
Yeah, that was really interesting about all of this. But they did it with the intent of matching or taking down the Star Wars action figure collection, because that was the biggest collection at the time. Was everybody was into Star Wars action figures, so they wanted something for their line to match it as well, because it was coming out from Mattel, as well to have boys' toys for Mattel, because Mattel owned the Barbie line. And that was their flagship toy is Barbie. But they had nothing for boys. So they came up with He-Man. And you're right. I had no idea about any of this. Like I said, I didn't even know. And here my friend from across the alley comes over and says, I want to get He-Man. And I'm like, who the hell's He-Man? So I had no clue about who He-Man was or where it came from or anything, just like you did. So this was really interesting to find all this out.
And I said this in the first two reviews, and I'm going to say it again here, is the people who worked on He-Man, who created Skeletor here and created this line of figures, loved their job. You could tell because they were laughing and joking and talking about how they create, and they loved it. And it's just one of those things that is like, man, I wish I could do this. It's like, and they're all retired again now, but they loved it. They loved doing He-Man.
And often people thought they took hits from the bone.
See, again, the guys were like, coming up with these crazy characters and He-Man names, and when they actually created the line of He-Man, they didn't have nothing. Like I said, they had this. They had He-Man, and the guy's like, okay, well, what are you going to come out with him? And he's like, let's come out with a comic book. And he's just kind of making it up, telling these people who are going to spend millions of dollars on this toy line. And so they come out, they put a comic book in every figure, and they're like, well, 5-year-olds that this is, are made for can't read comics.
By doing that, he was able to secure the money and everything and the financing to actually make the line. So he did what he set out to do with it. And that's what was really, really cool about all that. But I also like the fact that these guys, I'm joking about it here, but at the same time, these guys were serious. They all sat down drinking together, trying to come up with characters and come up with this toy line and come up with comic books and all this stuff to come with it. And literally sitting there drinking, coming up with different names for different figures, like Claw Hand, and what was the other ones?
Fisto. Yeah.
And I love what they said about Merman, because they were going to call him Seaman.
And And like, yeah, you can't really say that too fast, can you?
Oh, I love that. I was laughing my ass off when they were coming up with this stuff. And then you had the one guy sitting there going, bong.
And the guy who actually sculpted He-Man, who made him for the first time, was into like bodybuilding, and he was into physical fitness, and that's why he looks, like he does. And there has, I don't think to this point ever, been a figure that's been as buff as He-Man. I mean, this is it. I mean, how much more buff can you get than this, really?
And I always liked the size of the figures as well. I actually liked their size. I mean, for a different figure line, a different action figure, that's one thing I always really liked about it, how buff it was, and the actual size of the figures, because they were like 5.5 inches, I believe.
Exactly, and it's a great size for an action figure, especially when the kids are playing with these guys. It's not like the size of a Barbie, and it's much larger than a Star Wars figure, and because of that, you can put a lot more detail and stuff in this guy, and it's an actual perfect size for an action figure.
I actually love the part where they were coming up with Battle Cat and Panther and everything. I love when they were coming up with that, because the guy went down there and said, well, we need to find something for He-Man to ride, and they looked at one of their old toy lines. It was with their Big Jim line, and they looked at one of their toy lines, and they found this tiger or whatever, this cat, and he took that and then turned that into Battle Cat, and the guy comes down to look at it. He goes, okay, well, you got to put a saddle on it. And he's like, why would I put a saddle on it? And then he's like, I don't know, figure it out.
And they're like, well, they already made He-Man. They had this cat for another line, so let's throw a saddle on the cat, and now He-Man, or Skeletor, has a ride, and it's a perfect size for him. And again, they were just pulling this stuff out of their butt and just making it up. And that's, I think, the reason why this toy line was so amazing, just because the amount of imagination and fun they had making it.
Mattel's flagship toy was Barbie, and it was all for girls. They had their Barbie. They already had their Barbie. So they come out with, He-Man, and it's strictly, this is their toy line for boys. But they found out that girls were collecting He-Man figures too. So now they decided to make a He-Man figure for the girls. And that's what killed it. That's what killed the whole thing.
So overall, I think this is a great episode. Probably my favorite. It is my favorite out of... And I can't say it because we haven't done the fourth one yet. But it is. This whole season, this is my favorite episode. And I am giving it another 5 out of 5, just like I have for the rest of the series.
And that goes double for me. I would also give it a 5 out of 5. I absolutely enjoyed this episode. I thought it was fantastic.
So right after this is something I am super excited, because I've been wanting to do this for a long time here on It Figures, is to review some of the classic figures I have and go through the line up until the recent figure. Funko actually came out with a line of He-Man figures now, and I did get one of them to do for the review. So I'm going to go from the original guy, which is him, to when they brought him back out, sort of the anime style, to now the Funko one. So I'm really super excited about it, and hopefully you guys will tune in right after this and watch the original He-Man figures.
Tell everybody about us too. Get it out there. Bong.